Do you need this, Mrs. Kemp?
Seven long years have passed since the movie Mattness channel died. When last we checked in, Obama was still president, I was battling depression, and none of my favorite teams seemed destined to win a championship. A lot can change in 7 years. And since we're all under quarantine right now, waiting out a virus that wants to kill our parents and grandparents, it seems the perfect time to bring movie Mattness back from the dead. And speaking of coming back from the dead, guess what we're talking about today? Well, the end of the world is upon us, at least according to a handful of blathering paranoids on Twitter. And while movies like Contagion, Pandemic, and Containment are trending high on streaming services, I'm not that interested in our virus du jour's worst-case scenario. I'm more interested in the quarantine itself. Not the waiting out of an historic plague like the 10 Storytellers in Boccaccio's Decameron, but rather the horror film experience of being sequestered, regardless of circumstances and the ways in which people make the best of the situation. For my money, the best example of this sequestration occurs in George Romero's seminal classic Dawn of the Dead, which premiered in 1978 but did not enjoy widespread release in the States until May of 1979. In Dawn of the Dead, an unexplained epidemic compels the dead to come back to life and feast on the flesh of the living. 4 intrepid survivors seek shelter in a secluded shopping mall, and after securing the premises and establishing their living quarters, they fall into a series of mundane attempts to recreate a state of normalcy. Just 20 months prior to Dawn of the Dead hitting theaters, the disturbing Salo, or the 120 Days of Sodom, came to America in limited release. Premiering at the Paris Film Festival in November 1975, just 3 weeks after the brutal murder of its writer-director Pierpaolo Pasolini, Salo didn't start making the rounds in Europe until January 1976, and didn't make it to America until October 1st, 1977, in limited release. A mere 600 days separates the release of these two films in America, and their similarities are kind of startling. For one thing, Romero wrote the screenplay for Dawn of the Dead in Rome in 1975, roughly the same time Pasolini was shooting the courtyard scenes for Salo at nearby Cinecittà Studio. Furthermore, principal photography for Dawn of the Dead began in Pittsburgh a mere 8 weeks after Salo premiered in the US. But the greatest similarities are narrative and thematic. Both films take place in large, opulent palaces where our characters are sequestered. Both films feature 4 leads who are waiting out the end of the world, or at least the end of their world. And both films have some inconvenient ideas about consumerism, ideas that are sadly echoed in our current quarantine state. In Salo, or the 120 Days of Sodom, we open in Italy near the end of World War II. The Allies are advancing. Mussolini's fascist regime is coming to an end. 4 wealthy libertines, each representing a pillar of Italian power, decide to spend their final days constructing a decadent orgy to end all orgies. Our 4 libertines are a duke, representing the aristocracy, a magistrate representing the legal system, a bishop representing the church, and the president representing the governing bodies. Collectively, they decide to abduct 16 peasant youths, imprison them in a luxurious Italian villa, and act out their lascivious desires on the bodies of these poor kids. I'm going to keep it tame, but if you're easily upset, you might want to skip the next couple of minutes. You've been warned. The libertines act out their fantasies with these teens through rape, as in a bizarre mock wedding that doesn't end well for the happy couple, humiliation, as when the youths are led around naked like dogs, beatings, twisted sexual fetishes, and finally dismemberment and death. Midway through these proceedings is perhaps the most talked about set piece of the film, an elegant banquet where the main course is human feces. Clearly, Salo, or the 120 Days of Sodom, is not for the faint of heart. But is it art, or just stylized torture porn? I consider both perspectives in a handful of episodes on my podcast, which will be linked below. But for the sake of this channel, I want to address what appears to be Pasolini's intent when making this film. Salo is about the end of the world as its inhabitants know it. It's the end of World War II. Mussolini is losing control of Italy, and his power has been reduced to a puppet state established in the village of Salo on the banks of Lake Garda. Our four libertines may be intellectual bullies and abusive assholes, but they can read the writing on the wall, or at very least hear the rumble of Allied aircrafts overhead. Their way of life is over. Their time is up. As such, the purpose of their disturbing orgy is to distract themselves from the inevitable. They do this by consuming all the resources they have at hand, including the human body. Pasolini himself said in his final interview before his death that humanity is trapped in what he called a, quote, horrid order based upon the idea of owning and destroying, end quote. It's a programmed response, really, to own, consume, and destroy, the only thing these four trolls know. A grown-up in their situation might invest energy into finding place and purpose in the new world, but Salo's four libertines lack imagination. They don't even know how to throw a good orgy. They have to enlist four aging prostitutes to share lurid stories to inspire their grotesque and abusive actions. These four clowns are like emasculated perverts who require pornography to have sex. Now, what does this have to do with the current COVID-19 quarantine? Well, aside from the fact that our libertines are sheltering in place the way we've been asked to do, it really comes down to one word: consumerism. Pasolini said one of the great tragedies is that we are educated into a culture that pushes the idea of owning things at any cost. This is not to say that it is wrong to desire things or work towards their acquisition. Rather, Pasolini is stating that we have been brainwashed into thinking our value as individuals is fundamentally conjoined with our ability to possess and consume. Therefore, we are compelled to do both beyond reason. We see this in the pillars of power even today: the indulgent way wealth is flaunted, the obsessive way the impoverished strive for it, and the tragic way commodities are consumed and discarded. In Salo or the 120 Days of Sodom, the human body is the commodity. One libertine even states that the bodies of these teenagers, quote, belong to us, end quote. This enables the four libertines to sexually abuse, degrade, and ultimately destroy these peasant youths without compunction or embarrassment. The youths aren't people to these libertines, they're simply commodities, and the possessor of any commodity can do with it whatever he wants. This theme is carried over in George Romero's less disgusting but no less violent masterpiece, Dawn of the Dead. Once again, we have four protagonists brought together for the end of the world. Instead of an early 19th century Romanesque villa in northern Italy, we have a 20th century shopping mall in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And instead of advancing Allied armies looking to liberate a country, we have an army of flesh-eating zombies looking to consume it. The message of consumerism in this film is heavy-handed, especially when one compares scenes of zombies trying to get inside the mall with pictures of present-day consumers waiting outside a mall on Black Friday. But the consumerist theme that always resonates with me most is the way our four heroes behave once they've secured the mall and eliminated the zombies within. Much like Salo's libertines and the zombies outside, they begin to consume, using the mall's higher-end goods to enhance their lives. Within the confines of the mall, their lives become stalled and they become distracted and bored, what Pasolini observed as an unfortunate side effect of overabundance. Things only liven up when a nomadic biker gang discovers the mall and wages war with our heroes for its contents. And even the thickest of viewers can see the futility of this conflict. The fact is, this is a huge shopping mall with enough merchandise for hundreds of survivors, and yet the greed of a dozen or so people transforms the space into a battle zone. It's not hard to see what Romero was going for here. One of the things that makes Dawn of the Dead the perfect companion piece to Pasolini's Salo or the 120 Days of Sodom is that the later film clarifies Pasolini's message and makes it more accessible. It's hard to think about the dangers of consumerism while watching Salo because of its shock factor, but there's little doubt what Romero was trying to say when he gives us vacant-eyed zombies shuffling around a shopping mall. But there's something else I picked up on recent viewing, an added contextual layer of consumerism so obvious that I'm surprised it took me 40 years in the coronavirus quarantine to see it. The zombies are never satisfied. They never get full. They never stop coming, they never stop eating. Certainly, we observe them and fear the day when we might start consuming each other. But do we ever see the zombies pause from their consumption and allow what they've eaten to digest? We do not. The zombies are insatiable machines, unable to be satisfied no matter how much flesh they consume. just as the libertines in Salo are so insatiable that they turn youth, beauty, and the human body into a commodity. There is never a point where someone says enough, where anyone has the imagination or insight to realize he has consumed much more than he needs. Something to think about now that Walmart can't keep toilet paper in stock.
All right, we've seen what you can do with a boy. How are you when they come a little bigger?